January 1945, somewhere in the American Midwest. The wind howled across the barbed wire fences, carrying with it the dry chill of a North American winter. Beyond the guard towers, rows of wooden barracks stood in strict formation. Inside the wire, hundreds of German prisoners of war moved in quiet order, men who had once fought on distant fronts under the banner of the Third Reich. Their uniforms were stripped of insignia, their boots dusty from weeks of transport across the Atlantic. This morning, something unusual was happening. A military truck rolled through the gates, escorted by 2 armed MPs. But instead of ammunition or rations, it carried a single woman in civilian clothing. She stepped down, carrying a folded massage table and a bag of oils. The American guards greeted her with casual familiarity. Moments later, in full view of the prisoners, she was ushered into the officers' quarters. Laughter followed. The German POWs stood still and puzzled. In their minds, war meant deprivation, hardship, brutality. Yet here, their captors summoned comfort as casually as they summoned a jeep. For many, this was the first quiet shock of defeat. To understand why this single act carried such power, we must step back to a world on the brink of collapse and capture. By the winter of 1944, the tide of war in Europe had turned decisively. The Allied landings in Normandy the previous June had shattered Hitler's Atlantic Wall, opening a gateway into the heart of occupied France. Within weeks, American, British, and Canadian divisions were pushing inland, grinding through the Bocage country, driving the Wehrmacht back in a slow but relentless advance. The German army, once the spearhead of conquest, was now retreating under pressure from both west and east. Soviet forces were sweeping through Poland and the Baltics, pushing toward Berlin from one side, while Anglo-American armies advanced through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands on the other. The once formidable German military machine was now a fractured force, stretched thin, undersupplied, and suffering catastrophic losses. In the aftermath of the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, nearly 50,000 German soldiers were encircled and captured, their divisions annihilated in the open fields of Normandy. Across the Western Front, hundreds of thousands more surrendered in the months that followed, often in entire regimental groups. These were not isolated incidents, but part of a vast collapse of German defensive positions. As the Allies moved toward the Rhine, the number of prisoners swelled far beyond anything the European theater could contain. American field commanders faced a logistical problem unprecedented in modern war. What to do with hundreds of thousands of German POWs? Temporary cages near the front could only hold so many. Camps in Britain were already full. The solution came from across the Atlantic. Starting in mid-1943 but accelerating dramatically after Normandy, the United States launched an enormous prisoner transport operation. Captured Germans were shipped to American soil aboard empty Liberty ships that had delivered war materiel to Europe. Rather than return to America in ballast, these ships now carried human cargo. The voyages were long but secure. Convoys crossed the Atlantic under the cover of naval escorts, threading through waters still stalked by U-boats. For the German prisoners, the journey itself was a surreal transition, from the war-torn ruins of Europe to the calm, sprawling heartlands of the United States. Many had been told by Nazi propaganda that capture by the Americans meant torture or death. Instead, they found themselves treated according to the 1929 Geneva Convention, which mandated humane treatment for prisoners of war. Upon arrival at ports like New York, Norfolk, and Boston, they were processed and sent inland by train to camps scattered across 46 U.S. states. By 1945, more than 425,000 German POWs were held in America, spread across some 700 camps, from Texas cotton fields to the pine forests of Minnesota. The prisoners ranged from hardened Waffen-SS veterans to teenage conscripts swept up in the Reich's final mobilization. The scale was staggering. Camp commanders were tasked not only with security but also with feeding, housing, and managing a population equivalent to a mid-sized European city, all while maintaining discipline and complying with international law. The American home front, meanwhile, was thriving economically. War production was in full swing. Civilian life, though affected by rationing, remained far more stable and comfortable than in bomb-scarred Europe. The German POWs were entering a world fundamentally different from the one they had left behind. For the United States, Bringing POWs onto home soil was not merely a logistical necessity. It was also a controlled environment, far away from the chaos of the front lines, where the prisoners could be guarded cheaply, put to work legally under the Geneva Convention, and kept away from potential escape routes. The camps themselves varied in size and sophistication. Some were large, purpose-built compounds holding tens of thousands of men. Others were satellite camps, smaller temporary facilities set up near farms and factories where POWs were assigned as laborers. Regardless of location, most followed a standardized layout: barbed wire fences, watchtowers, barracks, mess halls, infirmaries, and recreation areas. For many captured Germans, their first sight of these camps was bewildering. There was order, discipline, but also an unexpected sense of normalcy. The guards were often reservists, many older men who treated the prisoners with professional detachment rather than cruelty. There were strict rules, but also predictable routines. This was not the brutal Eastern Front. This was not a Soviet gulag or a collapsing Reich. This was America, secure, confident, and far removed from the war's devastation. And as the trains rolled into these camps, thousands of German soldiers unknowingly stepped into a psychological battlefield they had never been trained for. The physical fences were obvious. The cultural and emotional ones were only just beginning to appear. For the German prisoners, the days that followed arrival in the camps were a study in contrasts. Each man was assigned to a barracks, issued basic clothing, and registered according to rank and unit. Military hierarchy among the POWs was preserved. Officers and enlisted men were housed separately, and German NCOs retained some authority over discipline inside the barracks. Daily life was governed by strict but predictable routines. Reveille sounded at dawn. Roll call followed under the watchful eyes of armed guards in the towers. Work details were organized for enlisted men, while officers were generally exempt in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Meals were served at set times, inspections were regular, and curfews were absolute. But beneath this military structure lay a surprising layer of comfort, at least compared to the wartime Europe they had left behind. Rations were plentiful by their standards: meat, vegetables, bread, and sometimes even fruit. German prisoners often ate better in American camps than many civilians back home in Germany. Red Cross inspections ensured compliance with international standards, and any serious mistreatment could result in diplomatic consequences. Work assignments were central to the camp system. Under Article 27 of the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be compelled to work, though never in war-related industries. Across rural America, POWs were sent to pick cotton, harvest crops, cut timber, or perform maintenance work. They were paid a small wage in camp scrip, which they could spend at the canteen on items like toiletries, stationery, and sometimes sweets or cigarettes. For American communities, this was a practical solution to wartime labor shortages. For the German prisoners, it was often their first direct exposure to American civilian life. Farmers treated them with pragmatic courtesy. Guards supervised, but rarely with brutality. Many POWs were astonished to see small-town stores full of goods, clean streets, and civilians going about their lives untouched by bombing or rationing on the scale of Germany. Medical care was another revelation. Camps included infirmaries staffed by U.S. Army medical personnel, sometimes assisted by captured German doctors. POWs received vaccinations, dental care, and treatment for injuries. The same military hospitals that served American soldiers often treated prisoners with equivalent professionalism. But perhaps the most disorienting element for the prisoners was the psychological atmosphere. Nazi propaganda had prepared them to expect a barbaric enemy, ruthless, uncivilized, intent on revenge. Instead, they encountered a society that was materially abundant, culturally relaxed, and seemingly unconcerned by their presence. American guards were often casual, sometimes even friendly. Discipline was maintained firmly, but unnecessary cruelty was rare. Many guards saw the prisoners as defeated soldiers, not monsters. They addressed them through interpreters, followed regulations, and occasionally joked across the wire. This detached confidence was itself a kind of power. Within the camps, recreation was encouraged. To maintain order and occupy idle minds, the U.S. military allowed sports, musical performances, and even educational programs. Soccer fields were laid out inside the wire. Theater groups performed plays in German. Prisoners published camp newspapers, painted murals, and sometimes staged orchestral concerts. Educational initiatives were particularly significant. By late 1944, the U.S. Army had begun re-education programs, introducing democratic ideas, distributing carefully selected literature, and allowing discussions that subtly undermined Nazi ideology. Not every camp embraced these efforts equally, but for many prisoners, the steady exposure to a functioning democracy, even in captivity, planted seeds that would grow long after the war. The cultural contrast was profound. These were men raised in a totalitarian system that glorified struggle and sacrifice. They had been told that the Allies were decadent, weak, incapable of sustaining real war. Yet in the heart of America, they saw modern machinery, endless supplies, and soldiers who could relax, laugh, and bring comforts into their lives, even as the war raged overseas. Inside the barbed wire, whispers spread quickly. Stories of unexpected kindness, of luxuries glimpsed through the fence, of American soldiers enjoying privileges unimaginable in the collapsing Reich. For some prisoners, it was unsettling. For others, quietly seductive. By 1945, this psychological undercurrent became increasingly important. The war in Europe was nearing its end. German morale was crumbling, and many prisoners began to reassess not only their situation, but the entire worldview they had carried into battle. It was in this environment, one of strict discipline but unexpected humanity, of defeat tempered by observation, that singular moment stood out with lasting impact. One such moment would occur when American officers, in full view of the camp, casually brought in a civilian masseuse, a gesture that struck the prisoners harder than any shouted threat. The scene was not just about comfort. It was about power, culture, and perception. And to grasp its full significance, we must examine the situation from multiple perspectives, from the minds of the prisoners to the strategies of their captors. By early 1945, many of the men behind the wire were not broken in body, but in certainty. The human side of this story begins with them. These were soldiers who had fought across Europe, from the beaches of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes. Many were career soldiers. Others were young conscripts swept up in the desperate mobilizations of the final years of the Reich. They arrived in America not as individuals, but as fragments of an army that once believed itself invincible. The shock of capture was often softened by exhaustion. Weeks of retreat, hunger, and aerial bombardment had eroded their pride. Yet beneath their silence lay a shared assumption that captivity would mean suffering, perhaps even death. Instead, they found themselves in a land untouched by the ruins of war. While they labored in fields or walked under the clear skies of the American Midwest, their minds wrestled with a reality that did not match the image painted by their propaganda. Some clung stubbornly to ideology, organizing underground Nazi committees within the barracks. Others watched quietly, their worldview beginning to crack. It was not a single conversation or lecture that shifted their perception. It was daily exposure to abundance. They noticed the guards' uniforms were clean and well-fitted. They saw officers reading newspapers with ease, cigarettes in hand, unconcerned. They saw civilians with cars, radios, full pantries. Even in defeat, they could not ignore what surrounded them. For the American soldiers stationed at these camps, life was different still. Many were far from the front, assigned to guard duty because of age, medical reasons, or rotation from combat. They lived in relative comfort. They had canteens stocked with coffee, chocolate, and beer. They listened to swing music on the radio. They received letters from home, photographs of family gatherings, sometimes weekend passes to nearby towns. Their days followed routine but not hardship. Unlike their German captives, they were not struggling for survival. They were maintaining security in a country that had never felt the war on its soil. To the prisoners, these men appeared relaxed, confident, and materially secure. The difference between captor and captive was not just power. It was environment. The psychological impact of this disparity was immense. German soldiers had been taught that their enemies were culturally inferior, corrupt, or weakened by decadence. Yet here they were, staring through wire at a society where even ordinary soldiers enjoyed luxuries that seemed unimaginable. Coca-Cola bottles clinked in the hands of guards. Newspapers carried headlines of Allied advances. Radios played music late into the night. When an American officer casually arranged for a masseuse to visit the base, the event spread through the camp like wildfire. It wasn't just curiosity. For many prisoners, it was a symbol, a moment that encapsulated the sheer distance between their world and the Americans. They watched as the woman arrived, greeted with polite laughter, her equipment unloaded without fanfare. She was not there for prisoners, nor was she hidden from them. The message, unspoken but clear, was one of effortless superiority. The Americans could afford comfort in the middle of a global war. They did not need to prove strength with brutality. Their strength was visible in their ease. For German prisoners who had endured freezing foxholes and collapsing supply lines, this scene was almost surreal. It was not intended as propaganda, yet it achieved what leaflets and speeches could not. It quietly undermined their certainties. These moments would repeat in different forms across camps, sometimes with a concert, sometimes with a delivery of ice cream, sometimes with American soldiers discussing baseball while prisoners listened. It was through these everyday observations that the psychological battlefield unfolded, subtle but relentless, laying the groundwork for deeper shifts that would emerge as the war drew to a close. Behind the barbed wire and guard towers, there was an invisible machinery at work. The American prisoner of war system was not improvised. It was built with methodical precision. The logistical framework that allowed hundreds of thousands of Germans to be housed, fed, and transported across the United States was unlike anything the Axis had imagined. The War Department established a tiered structure. Base camps, branch camps, and work detachments, all linked by rail networks and standardized regulations. Supplies flowed with military efficiency. Medical shipments arrived on schedule. Canteens were stocked through existing civilian supply chains. What the prisoners saw as casual abundance was in fact the product of a vast, organized wartime economy that functioned without interruption. To German soldiers who had watched their own logistics collapse under Allied bombing, this efficiency was astonishing. In Germany, trains were diverted to move refugees. Fuel shortages crippled divisions, and Allied air power reduced infrastructure to rubble. In America, even in the middle of war, trains arrived on time. Food was plentiful. Buildings were intact. It was not only what the prisoners saw, but what they realized. Their enemy had built a system capable of waging a world war while still sustaining a comfortable life at home. The contrast between the collapsing Reich and the humming stability of the United States could not have been sharper. Above this logistical structure stood leadership decisions shaped by both law and strategy. From the beginning, the U.S. military had chosen to adhere strictly to the Geneva Convention of 1929. The intention was twofold. First, to set a clear moral and legal standard for the treatment of prisoners, ensuring that American POWs held overseas might receive reciprocal treatment. Second, to maintain discipline and order by creating predictable, regulated environments in which German soldiers would have little incentive to resist or rebel. Commanders understood that mistreatment led to unrest while routine led to compliance. The humane treatment was not born of sentimentality. It was a calculated policy designed to maintain stability across hundreds of camps. Officers were trained to avoid unnecessary brutality, to use structure and predictability as tools of control. There was also a subtler dimension. American leadership understood the psychological impact of generosity and order. By treating prisoners with a level of fairness they did not expect, the U.S. undermined Nazi propaganda at its core. The Third Reich had portrayed the Allies as barbaric and degenerate. When prisoners were instead met with abundant food, medical care, and even exposure to democratic ideas, the ideological armor many had worn began to weaken. Some clung harder to their beliefs, forming underground Nazi groups within camps. Others quietly observed and rethought their assumptions. The leadership's decision to maintain high standards of treatment was, in its own way, a form of psychological warfare. The moral dimension was perhaps the most profound. The Americans did not attempt to match brutality with brutality. They displayed a different kind of power, one rooted in confidence and resources. This was not to say the system was perfect. There were instances of abuse, racism, and hostility. But on the whole, the treatment of German POWs in the United States stood in sharp contrast to the often harsh and neglectful conditions faced by Allied prisoners in Axis camps. German POWs in America witnessed something few had expected: a society capable of defeating them militarily while maintaining its moral and legal structures. This moral posture had strategic consequences. It broke the image of the enemy as an uncivilized oppressor. It replaced fear with quiet awe. For many prisoners, this moral and logistical strength was embodied not in grand speeches but in the small details. The efficiency of camp routines, the consistent fairness of the guards, and the visible luxuries the Americans afforded themselves. These details lingered in the minds of the men long after they returned to their barracks at night. It was through this blend of structure, leadership, and moral clarity that the Americans set the stage for moments like the Masseuse's visit to resonate so deeply. The prisoners had not simply lost a war. They had stepped into a world that functioned differently from everything they had been taught to believe. The morning the truck arrived began like any other. The prisoners had lined up for roll call under the pale winter sun, their breath fogging in the frigid air. Guards in heavy coats paced the perimeter, rifles slung casually across their shoulders. There was a rhythm to these mornings. Count, distribute work assignments, march the labor detachments out through the gate. Inside the fence, routines gave the camp its shape. But that day, the sound of tires crunching over the gravel drew every eye toward the entrance. An olive-drab truck pulled to a stop just beyond the inner fence. Two military policemen stepped out, exchanging brief words with the gate guard. From the back of the truck, a civilian woman climbed down. She carried a folded massage table under one arm and a small leather case in the other. Her coat was neat, her hair tied back, her demeanor calm. To the prisoners, she seemed entirely out of place. Women rarely appeared near the camps, and certainly not in such a role. She was met by an American officer who greeted her with a polite smile, as if they were at a social appointment rather than inside a military compound. Together, they walked toward the officers' quarters, the MPs following at a distance. The prisoners watched silently. Conversations died out mid-sentence. From the towers, even some of the guards leaned slightly to observe. Through the windows of the officers' building, the scene unfolded with disarming normalcy. The massage table was set up in a heated room. A record player hummed faintly in the background. The officer removed his jacket, laughed with a colleague, and disappeared inside. Outside, rows of German soldiers stood rigid, processing what they were seeing. This was not a medical emergency, not a Red Cross inspection, not military business. This was comfort, deliberate, open, and almost theatrical in its lack of secrecy. For many of these men, the last months of combat had been defined by deprivation. On the Western Front, they had slept in frozen trenches, eaten meager rations, and fought without air cover as Allied bombers dominated the skies. Supplies had dwindled. Fuel was scarce. Even officers had little relief from the grinding collapse of their lines. The idea of an officer calling in a masseuse would have been unthinkable in their world. In this moment, the distance between their defeated army and the Americans was no longer measured in tanks or aircraft. It was measured in something far more human, the ability to live well even in war. Word spread through the camp within hours. Prisoners whispered about the woman in the truck, the relaxed demeanor of the officers, the music playing faintly behind closed doors. Some reacted with silent bitterness, others with quiet fascination. A few dismissed it as arrogance, but many were unsettled. The Americans were not trying to impress them, and that made the gesture even more powerful. It was not propaganda. It was reality. Camp interpreters reported subtle shifts in conversation during interrogations that week. Some prisoners spoke more openly. Their resistance softened. Others asked curious questions about life in the United States, about civilian life, about whether ordinary soldiers could afford such things. What no leaflet or lecture could achieve, a single act of visible comfort had accomplished. It forced the prisoners to confront the gulf between their expectations and what stood before them. The guards understood the effect, even if they didn't articulate it. They had seen prisoners react to concerts, ice cream deliveries, or baseball games in much the same way. These were small moments, but in an environment built on discipline and routine, they carried outsized weight. And as the German prisoners returned to their barracks that evening, the image of the masseuse stepping down from the truck remained vivid in their minds, a quiet reminder of where they now stood in the world's balance of power. In the days that followed, the incident became more than a passing curiosity. It turned into a quiet marker, a story repeated in low voices between bunks and along the work lines. At first, the retelling was laced with disbelief. Some men claimed they had misheard. Others suggested it was staged to humiliate them. But the facts were undeniable. The officers had brought in a civilian masseuse openly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Within the camp, subtle shifts began to emerge. For weeks, American interrogators had faced the usual wall of reserve. German prisoners, especially officers, were disciplined in their responses. Many offered only their name, rank, and serial number, following military code to the letter. But after the incident, the atmosphere changed. Conversations grew less rigid. Some prisoners, curious rather than confrontational, asked questions about American life during interrogations. How common were such luxuries? Were ordinary soldiers allowed similar freedoms? Was this treatment only for officers? These weren't questions born of idle chatter. They reflected genuine cracks in the ideological armor many had worn since their capture. American officers understood the value of these moments, even if the masseuse's visit itself had not been planned as psychological strategy. U.S. intelligence had long recognized the power of what they called controlled exposure. Rather than overwhelming prisoners with propaganda, they allowed them to observe American society through their own eyes. A luxury witnessed was more convincing than a lecture delivered. The masseuse became an unintentional but potent tool of soft power. It demonstrated, without words, that the Americans lived in a world of abundance and confidence. Among the prisoners, responses varied. Die-hard Nazis seethed, claiming it was decadent weakness, proof that the Americans had grown soft. But even their defiance carried a defensive edge. Others, particularly younger conscripts and those who had grown weary of the war, found themselves quietly impressed. Some began to view their captors with a kind of reluctant respect. They might not have liked the Americans, but they could not deny the reality in front of them. In the barracks at night, these reactions played out in whispered debates. A handful of staunch ideologues tried to maintain control, reminding everyone of their duty to the fatherland. But the symbolic power of the scene lingered. It didn't inspire immediate conversions or grand ideological shifts. It did something subtler. It eroded certainty. For many prisoners, captivity had already exposed them to new realities: plentiful food, functioning infrastructure, relaxed guards. The masseuse's visit condensed all of that into one vivid moment. It revealed not just that the Americans were winning, but how they were winning, with a level of resources and ease that the German war machine could no longer match. The Americans, for their part, continued their routines. The guards neither referenced the event nor exaggerated its importance. It was treated like any other day, and that very normality amplified its effect. Psychological warfare often relies on careful planning. Here it worked because it was unplanned, authentic, and visible. As weeks turned into months, the camp command reported noticeable shifts in prisoner behavior. There was less tension during work assignments. Fewer disciplinary incidents occurred. Some prisoners volunteered information during interrogations, not out of coercion, but from a growing curiosity and a subtle recalibration of their place in the conflict. A few even began participating more willingly in re-education programs, reading the pamphlets and newspapers provided by camp authorities. The masseuse had not brought defeat. The front lines in Europe had done that, but she had, in one unassuming moment, made the prisoners feel the depth of that defeat in a way no battlefield could. It wasn't about military power, it was about cultural confidence. A society that could afford comfort during war signaled to its captives that their old world was gone, and a new one was rising before their eyes. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the war ended, but the story of the German prisoners in the United States entered a new phase. The camps that had once been temporary holding facilities now became structured environments for transition. These men were no longer active combatants. They were captives of a victorious power, living under rules designed to reshape, not destroy, their outlook. The U.S. military, working alongside civilian agencies, launched what became known as the Special Projects Division, a quiet, systematic re-education program. Its aim was not crude indoctrination, but exposure. German prisoners were offered carefully selected books, newspapers, and discussion groups that emphasized democratic values, free speech, and historical facts censored under the Nazi regime. Camp libraries were stocked with literature that had been banned in Germany. American newsreels were screened. showing the war's devastation and the Nuremberg revelations about concentration camps. Interrogators noted that the most effective persuasion came not from lectures but from sustained voluntary engagement. The prisoners, many of whom had spent months observing American life, were now given intellectual tools to process what they had seen. Meanwhile, the daily structure of camp life continued with renewed intensity. The labor program expanded, with thousands of German POWs working on farms, in sawmills, canneries, and infrastructure projects. By the war's end, POW labor had become a significant contribution to the American home front. In states like Texas, Minnesota, and Arkansas, German laborers picked crops, built roads, and maintained factories suffering from manpower shortages. Under the Geneva Convention, they were paid fair wages for their work, not in U.S. currency but in camp credits. Many spent their earnings on small luxuries, postcards, toiletries, candy, or even musical instruments. Reports from camp inspectors described a striking pattern. Over time, many prisoners became invested in the routines. They formed soccer teams, orchestras, theater troupes. Some began corresponding with American civilians, including farmers who hired them. A few developed friendships that would last long after repatriation. This was not universal. Many remained distant, wary, or ideologically rigid. But the cumulative effect of daily exposure to a stable, functioning society was undeniable. The interrogation rooms reflected this change most clearly. Early in the war, questioning often yielded little. By late 1945, the atmosphere had softened. Many prisoners volunteered information about their units, logistics, or conditions in Germany, not out of coercion, but from a growing sense that their world had irrevocably changed. For some, cooperating with the Americans became a way to align themselves with what they increasingly saw as the winning, and perhaps more enduring, side. Repatriation, however, did not happen overnight. Logistical delays, transportation shortages, and post-war political complexities meant that many German POWs remained in the United States until 1946 or 1947. During this time, the camp system matured further. Prisoners received news from home, often grim stories of destroyed cities, hunger, and displacement. The contrast between the devastation of Germany and the relative calm of the American Midwest deepened their internal reflections. For men who had once believed themselves to be part of a conquering army, this prolonged stay was a period of reckoning. Some officers resisted any form of ideological shift, holding tightly to their training and beliefs. But among the younger conscripts and war-weary veterans, something quieter took root. Many began to see the United States not simply as an enemy, but as a model of stability they had never experienced. The memory of small moments, like the Masseuse's visit, or the easy abundance of camp canteens, became symbols of a society that had won not just through firepower, but through the strength of its systems and culture. By the time they boarded ships back to Europe, thousands of these prisoners carried with them impressions that would shape their future lives. Some returned to Germany and rebuilt their towns with new perspectives. A smaller number eventually emigrated back to the United States, drawn by the world they had glimpsed through barbed wire. Others never abandoned their old loyalties, but none could deny the imprint their captivity had left. The Americans had not set out to wage psychological war through comfort alone. Yet the combination of structure, exposure, and everyday reality proved to be one of the most powerful influences of their occupation. In the broader sweep of history, the German POW experience in the United States became more than a wartime footnote. It was an early quiet demonstration of how cultural and psychological power could shape the post-war world. By 1946, as the camps began to empty, American military and political leaders recognized that these prisoners were returning not to the same Germany they had left, but to a shattered nation about to be rebuilt from the ground up. What the prisoners carried back with them, memories, impressions, and sometimes admiration, became part of that reconstruction. Reports compiled by the War Department noted a surprising trend. Many returning POWs spoke positively about their treatment in the United States. They described plentiful food, fair discipline, and the strange sight of civilians living ordinary lives while their homeland had been reduced to rubble. For some, the camp experience softened their view of the former enemy. For others, it offered their first tangible understanding of democratic society. These impressions mattered. In the late 1940s, as West Germany began to form under Allied occupation, former POWs often played key roles in local administration, reconstruction, and cultural exchange. Some became teachers, journalists, or public servants, bringing with them a perspective shaped by their captivity. The impact extended to German-American relations. In the years after the war, many American farmers and civilians who had worked alongside POW laborers maintained correspondence with former prisoners. Letters crossed the Atlantic, sharing news of families, farms, and towns. A number of POWs eventually returned to the United States as immigrants, marrying American women or seeking new lives in the country that had once held them behind barbed wire. What had begun as an exercise in containment ended as a bridge between former enemies. Strategically, the lessons learned from the POW camps influenced future American military thinking. The idea that humane treatment, exposure to democratic systems, and cultural confidence could achieve what force could not became an enduring principle. In later conflicts, including the Korean War and even the Cold War's ideological contests, the United States would draw on this experience. It demonstrated that power was not only projected through weapons and armies, but through the visible stability and prosperity of a society. The Masseuse's visit, insignificant in itself, symbolized this power in its purest form, a display of ease during a time of total war. For the Germans who experienced it, the memory lingered. Some spoke of the incident years later in memoirs and interviews, not because it was dramatic, but because it was unforgettable. It encapsulated the distance between two worlds. In the collapsing Reich, officers rationed food, huddled in bombed-out shelters, and watched their armies disintegrate. In America, officers summoned comfort with a telephone call. The contrast was as stark as it was decisive. On the American side, this moral and psychological victory was understood intuitively rather than formally. The guards, officers, and civilians involved rarely considered themselves part of a grand strategy. They were simply living their lives within a nation at the height of its industrial and cultural power. Yet to the men watching through the wire, these ordinary acts were revelations. As repatriation continued, Allied intelligence noted a decline in ideological resistance among returning prisoners. Many who had once parroted Nazi slogans now expressed skepticism about their former leaders. Some described their captors with grudging respect. Others simply acknowledged that the world they had believed in no longer existed. This was not the result of indoctrination. It was the result of observation. The war had been decided on the battlefields of Europe, but its psychological aftershocks were felt in places far removed from combat, in quiet camps under American skies, where a single act of comfort could ripple across minds and years. The POW system, once seen as a logistical necessity, had become a tool of soft power. It showed that victory could be secured not only through conquest, but through the enduring weight of example. The wind that once cut through the camp fences has long faded. The wooden barracks have disappeared, their outlines preserved only in old photographs and the memories of men who stood behind the wire. Yet the story endures, not because of a single event, but because of what that event revealed. The Masseuse's visit was not about indulgence. It was about contrast. In that brief, ordinary moment, German prisoners saw a society so secure in its strength that it could afford comfort amid total war. They had come from a world collapsing under bombardment, where scarcity and fear defined existence. What they witnessed in the officers' quarters was something their training had never prepared them to understand. Power expressed not through force, but through ease. History often focuses on battles, generals, and strategies, but sometimes history turns on quieter moments. A truck pulling into a camp, a door closing behind a laughing officer, the stunned silence of men who realized that their old certainties no longer applied. The American treatment of German POWs was not perfect, but it embodied a kind of confidence that went beyond military victory. It showed that abundance, order, and moral clarity could shape minds as surely as any weapon. Many of those prisoners returned to a broken Germany, carrying with them the memory of those days. Some clung to their old beliefs. Others changed slowly over years, as the images of their captivity mingled with the ruins they found at home. In this way, a moment of quiet observation became part of the larger story of how nations reshape one another, not only through conquest, but through the lived example of their societies. In the end, the masseuse was just one person stepping off a truck on a cold morning, but to the men behind the wire, she represented the weight of a new world. A world that had not only defeated them on the battlefield, but had done so with a calmness that they could neither ignore nor easily forget.